Today on The Explainer, we are diving into a really fascinating, but frankly startling contradiction. We're looking at Pakistan's economy, where official reports are painting a picture of a solid recovery. You read the headlines and you'd think things are definitely on the mend. Budgets are balancing, international lenders seem pretty satisfied with the progress. But when we actually look at the lived reality of everyday people and dig into the hard, granular data, a completely different story emerges. This massive disconnect between macroeconomic high fives and ground-level distress is honestly one of the most pressing issues in the region right now.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to start with the human reality. Take Maria Ismail, whose story was recently featured by Arab News. Maria is a journalist. She's a highly educated white-collar professional. But after losing a long-term job, she's been forced to live entirely off her dwindling savings while grinding through a months-long job hunt. Her very real fear of having to take on debt just to survive? That is a quiet crisis playing out in millions of households today. When experienced professionals with degrees are struggling this much, you know for sure this isn't just an issue for day laborers. We are literally watching the hollowing out of a middle class.
And the sheer scale of the problem is just staggering. 7.1%. Now that is Pakistan's official unemployment rate projected for the fiscal year ending in June 2026. According to the government's own economic survey, unemployment has hit a 21-year high. Let that sink in for a second. Over 2 decades. We're talking about roughly 5.9 million people waking up every single morning, actively looking for work and just finding closed doors. That's millions of families forced to make impossible, heartbreaking choices about basic food, healthcare, and education.
So it begs the question, right? How exactly does a government celebrate economic stabilization while millions of its citizens find the doors of opportunity completely locked? Well, that is the paradox defining the modern Pakistani economy. Policymakers are essentially taking victory laps because they averted a default and stabilized the currency. But at the exact same time, the workforce is being crushed by a massive contraction in opportunities. It's a situation where the economic cure honestly feels just as painful as the disease itself. Here is the crux of the issue. The official narrative is super proud of a 3.7% GDP growth for the outgoing fiscal year, along with a strict 2% primary surplus. On a spreadsheet, that looks like incredibly disciplined fiscal management. But step away from those spreadsheets and hit the streets, and it's grim. While those big macro targets are technically being met, the country's poverty rate has surged to an 11-year high of 29%. Domestic demand is severely suppressed. Everyday folks simply can't afford to buy what they used to, which directly suffocates local businesses and sets off a vicious downward spiral.
Because think about the domino effect. When everyday people stop buying basic goods, inventories just pile up in warehouses. Local shopkeepers struggle to pay their bills, and businesses have to freeze hiring. Eventually, they resort to painful layoffs. This suppressed demand isn't just some abstract theory in an economics textbook. It dictates whether a family eats that night. When businesses can't sell, the entire economic engine just grinds to a complete halt. That domino effect is the daily reality for guys like Mohammed Yasser. He got sick, lost his steady job at a garment factory, and is now drowning in debt just trying to feed his wife and 4 kids. He's out searching for work from dawn to dusk, and everywhere he goes, companies tell him they are actively letting people go. It is a heartbreaking cycle of debt and constant rejection. You literally have people willing and eager to work, totally sidelined by an economy that has zero room for them.
And labor advocates, like the folks at the Salaried Class Alliance of Pakistan, are quick to point out that this isn't just a local factory problem. Over the last few years, there has been a massive exodus of multinational companies, and the reasons why are pretty clear. Between the prohibitive costs of doing business, wildly unpredictable import restrictions, and just crippling energy crises, foreign investors are throwing their hands up and packing out. When they leave, those high-paying, stable jobs vanish with them, leaving a massive vacuum behind.
Now, to show you that these aren't just isolated, unfortunate anecdotes, we need to dig into the actual data. Let's look at the official Pakistan Employment Trend Report 2025 from the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. Moving past the rosy headlines gives us the undeniable mathematical reality of where the workforce actually stands.
And just to be clear, this data isn't from some small, localized poll. This was a massive nationwide survey covering over 3,700 enumeration blocks and nearly 54,000 households. It gives us a highly credible, remarkably detailed snapshot of the country's employment structure. It tells us exactly who is working, what they are doing, and, most devastatingly, where the jobs have completely dried up. When you trace this data over the last few years, the rapid deterioration is kind of shocking. Back in fiscal year 2019, the poverty rate was at 22%. By the 2024-2025 reporting period, unemployment was sitting at 6%. But then, moving into fiscal year 2026, things unraveled fast. Unemployment spiked to that 21-year high of 7.1%, and poverty skyrocketed to an astonishing 29%. That leap to 29% means nearly one-third of the entire population is now living below the poverty line. Furthermore, when we break down the employment status of the people who do have jobs, it reveals a highly vulnerable workforce. Only 43.7% are actually wage and salaried workers. A massive 36.6% rely on what's called own account work. In plain English, that means a huge chunk of the population doesn't have a formal employer, no health insurance, and no guaranteed paycheck. They are hustling in a highly precarious, informal market just to survive. Honestly, they are one bad week away from total financial ruin.
If we divide this up by major sectors, services dominate at nearly 42%, followed by agriculture at 32.5%. But the critical industry sector? It is severely lagging at just 25.9%. Why? Because it's being suffocated by energy shortages, heavy taxation, and a total lack of investment. The industrial sector is historically the engine for creating stable, middle-class jobs. But right now, it simply can't grow. And without that industrial expansion, creating enough high-quality jobs is practically impossible.
Which brings us to an incredibly important baseline number. Economists calculate that Pakistan actually needs an annual GDP growth of up to 5% just to absorb the wave of new youth entering the labor force every single year. Remember how the government was celebrating a 3.7% growth rate? The gap between 3.7 and 5 is not just a rounding error. That gap translates to hundreds of thousands of real human beings, mostly young, educated kids, stepping into a job market that has absolutely zero space for them.
So, naturally, this severe lack of opportunity forces a huge question about the future. When you mix a sharp, globally aware, and highly ambitious youth population with a totally stagnant job market, what happens next? It is a demographic time bomb. And how these young people are reacting is entirely reshaping the nation's trajectory. The answer, which was heavily analyzed recently by the Friday Times, is a historic and accelerating brain drain. We are seeing a massive outflow of skilled professionals. We're talking doctors, engineers, software developers, business leaders. They are quietly packing up, and a lot of them have zero intention of ever returning. This isn't just losing current workers. This is actively exporting the very people needed to build a resilient economy for tomorrow. And you really have to think about it from their perspective. Leaving isn't just about chasing a slightly higher salary abroad. Imagine trying to plan your future when your currency devalues monthly, literally wiping out your savings. Or working under an educational system that rewards rote memorization over actual critical thinking. These young professionals crave predictability. They want physical safety, workplace fairness, basic civil liberties, and a system where hard work actually guarantees a stable, upwardly mobile life.
There's a powerful quote from that Friday Times piece. The real tragedy here isn't the migration itself. It's that migration has become the only viable form of financial and social insurance for these people. These brilliant minds feel entirely unheard and completely undervalued by the state. They aren't leaving because they hate their country. They're leaving because staying feels like a rigged bet with their future, one they are almost guaranteed to lose.
So if the human cost is this steep and the country's best talent is fleeing at record rates, why is the economic engine failing so badly at creating jobs? Well, that answer lies at the very top, in how the economy is fundamentally managed. Analysts point out that policymakers are relying heavily on something called growth compression for stabilization. What does that actually mean for you and me? It means the government is purposely slamming the brakes on the entire economy. They use tight monetary policy and squeeze out revenue just to balance the budget and keep lenders happy. But this strategy intentionally kills jobs. And worse, it acts as a smokescreen, totally masking the failure to implement real structural reforms. Agriculture stays trapped in low productivity, business costs keep soaring, and exports remain totally uncompetitive on the global stage.
And the cruelest irony of this whole stabilization setup? The burden of this economic adjustment falls squarely on the shoulders of compliant businesses and low to middle income families. They're the ones getting crushed by higher taxes, absorbing the brutal inflation, and facing the job losses, while the deep systemic flaws in the economy go completely untouched by the folks in power.
Look, to prevent this massive youth exodus from turning into a permanent hollowing out of national talent, something fundamental has to shift. You simply cannot legislate talent into staying in a stagnant environment. You have to actively build an ecosystem that makes staying a viable, exciting choice for their future. This requires a total rethink. Reversing this trend is going to take a committed, multi-step approach. First, the state has to finally tackle those deep structural bottlenecks with transparent, merit-based governance. Second, the private sector has to step up in a huge way, moving past exploiting cheap labor to actually offering fair wages and ethical work cultures. And third, universities must modernize. They have to bridge that massive gap between just printing degrees and actually teaching the practical, innovative skills that the global economy demands right now.
So we are left with a pretty provocative thought to chew on. When this current IMF stabilization program inevitably wraps up, is the country finally going to prioritize the deep structural reforms needed to generate real jobs? Or are we just going to see it continue sacrificing its brightest minds for the sake of temporary, paper-thin stabilization? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the data, and we will see you next time.